Well, one of the unique features of this book is the amount of space it gives to African religions. If you look at most of the introductory textbooks on world religions, they give between 6 and 20 pages to African religions. African religions are just dismissed as being primal religions or primitive religions. They don't use that word very much today, but that's how they used to be seen. And so generally people get the impression that there's nothing to say about religions in Africa and that they're unimportant. Now, Africa is a huge continent with a large population and a long history. And this has been totally left out of most accounts of world religions. And to understand the background to this, I think one's got to look at the way in which the study of religion developed in the 19th century, particularly with Max Muller. Max Muller was the father of religious studies, and what he did was base his understanding of religions on the available texts, and he was particularly interested in Indian religions. But to be fair to him, if you look at his more general books on the study of religion, he does talk about African religions a surprising amount. So when he did that, he drew upon the work of various missionaries and talked about African religion, but there was nothing left behind. So when he published his massive Sacred Books of the East series, which he had the collaboration of many scholars in Germany and Britain and France, and they produced this translation of the major religious texts, there was nothing on Africa because there were no religious texts available from Africa. African religions are oral religions and not written religions, so they're much more difficult to study. So that's the first reason, sort of practically, as to why African religions have got missed out or left out of religious studies textbooks. The other reason, which I think is significant, is to a very large extent people did look upon Africans as primitive, and they also looked upon Africans as second rate. I mean, Africa really, you can't take them seriously. There's nothing there to look at. And part of this, I think, goes back to the beginning of the 17th century, perhaps earlier, with slavery, and particularly the North Atlantic slave trade. Now, slavery had gone on much longer than the North Atlantic slave trade. It goes back to antiquity. Africans were enslaved, but particularly from the 7th century on, Africa was devastated by slavery. And the slave routes at that time ran through Arabia and to the east, not to the west. Once the North Atlantic slave trade was begun, it was convenient to see Africans as primitive. It was convenient to see Africans as not quite fully human. And one of the interesting things about this is if you look at the proceedings of something like the Royal Anthropological Society in London and its predecessor, the London Anthropological Society, in the late 19th century, in the from 1870s to about 1900, one finds there are quite a number of debates between anthropologists, people who were involved in what was developing as anthropology, because it wasn't then a university topic, but what was called anthropology, between people who were explorers and traders and missionaries. And the missionaries were arguing that Africans were human, that they were intelligent, and they were like everyone else. Whereas the others were arguing that, well, perhaps Africans should be seen as human, but they weren't really quite up to par. And this was a hangover from the slave trade, because one of the justifications of slavery was that Africans didn't have souls. Once the West secularized, that not having souls was changed to being not quite intelligent enough, and Darwinism, social Darwinism, came into play after 1857 and really affected the view of Europeans of Africans. And one can see this in the British Colonial Office documents. Before 1857, that is before the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species, the Colonial Office and the London British Imperial Archives, the officers spoke of Africa as having kings and kingdoms. After 1857, in the Colonial Office documents, they talk about chiefs and tribes. Now, there's an obvious sort of downgrading of Africa at this point, from kings and kingdoms, who are more or less like us, to tribes and chiefs. And this, I think, has had a lasting influence on religious studies. So you have this situation where African religions have been almost totally neglected in religious studies textbooks. And what we wanted to do in this book is reverse this trend and challenge people to take African religion seriously.